My daughter, Wren, is 11 years old, and she still sleeps with the hall light on. She didn't used to. Before last August, she was the kind of kid who would go out to the woodshed after dark to get a piece of kindling without being asked, who'd walk the half-mile of trail between our property and the Muller's place, in the evening, without a flashlight and without a second thought. She'd grown up in these woods. She knew them the way kids who grow up in towns know streets. By feel, by sound, by the way the light changes at different times of day, in different seasons, by which game trails run clear after rain, and which ones turn to mud. She doesn't do any of that now. And I want to say this clearly before I say anything else. Whatever followed her through that forest last August did not hurt her. She came home scared, but she came home whole. I need you to understand that before anything else, because everything that comes after is going to make it sound like she shouldn't have. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. My name is Dale Murchoch. I'm 43 years old. I work as a fisheries technician for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife out of the Quinault district, which puts me in the Quinault River drainage and the lower reaches of the Queets corridor more days a week than not. That's in the southwestern corner of the Olympic Peninsula, west of the Olympic Mountains, east of the Pacific coast, inside or adjacent to Olympic National Park and the surrounding national forest for most of my working hours. I've been doing this work for 16 years. Before that, I worked a hatchery on the Humptulips River for 4 years. And before that, I was on a trail crew out of the Quinault Ranger Station for 2 summers while I finished my degree at Evergreen State in Olympia. I am not someone who goes into these woods without understanding what lives in them. I am not someone who confuses what's been documented with what actually exists. That last sentence is important, so let me sit on it for a second. A lot of what actually exists in the Olympic Peninsula ecosystem doesn't get documented the way you'd want. The peninsula is a roadless wilderness in large sections. The Quinault drainage alone has hundreds of square miles of protected old-growth forest that most people never set foot in, not because it's inaccessible, but because the kind of access it requires, days of hiking on minimal trail, in country that's wet and steep and deeply forested, filters out everyone except the people who specifically seek that experience. In 16 years of fieldwork in this drainage, I have done much of my survey work in places I was the only human being for 10 miles in any direction. You develop a sense in conditions like that for what's known and what's merely assumed. They are not the same thing. I'm also not someone who believed in Bigfoot. I want to be clear about this because it matters for the credibility of what comes later. Not in the way that people sometimes say they don't believe in something when they find it slightly plausible and don't want to admit it. I mean, I genuinely placed the concept in the same mental folder as ghost photographs and UFO landing sites and other things I'd decided were the products of misidentification and wishful thinking applied to ambiguous stimuli. I'd heard the stories. You cannot work in the Quinault drainage for 16 years without hearing the stories. The Peterson print casts from the upper Quinault Valley in the early 2000s that the ranger station kept in a cardboard box in a back room and wouldn't officially acknowledge but also wouldn't throw away. Somebody senior enough to have a key to that room made a decision not to throw those away, and I always thought about that. The Queets River account from a Forest Service road crew in 1994 that circulated among the old-timers as a semi-serious, cautionary tale about what happens when you stop to investigate strange sounds on an evening drive back to the district office. I'd heard a dozen variants of a dozen different accounts over the years, and I'd listened politely and filed them under human pattern recognition, making mountains out of shadows. But I keep coming back to a specific conversation I had maybe 10 years ago with a Quinault tribal member named Ernie Sampson, because I think about it almost every day now, and I want to tell you about it before anything else. Ernie is in his late 60s. He still works seasonal salmon surveys for the Quinault Indian Nation, and I've been in the field with him maybe 30 times over the years. He knows the watershed the way I know it, but deeper. Family knowledge, generational knowledge, the kind you can't get from 16 years of professional field work because the professional field only goes back so far before the written record runs out. We were having coffee at the Quinault Lake Lodge after a long day of escapement counting on the upper river. The lodge is right on the south shore of the lake. November afternoon, the view from the dining room is straight across the water at the old-growth slopes rising on the north shore. Ernie was looking out the window, not talking, and I wasn't talking either. And then he said, not as a continuation of anything we'd been discussing, "You know what my grandfather called them?" I said, "Called what?" He looked at me in the way that serious outdoors people look at each other when the subject is real but the words are uncomfortable. He said the Quinault traditional term, which I'm not going to attempt to reproduce here because I don't speak the language and it deserves better than a phonetic guess from me. He translated it as close to the people who have always been here, or the deep timber people. He said there wasn't an exact English equivalent and he wasn't going to pretend there was. I said, "Are we talking about Bigfoot?" He said, "We're talking about what existed before that word." Then he said, "My grandfather said they know the difference between someone who's just passing through and someone who's staying. You've been in this drainage long enough that they've seen you plenty by now, probably more than you know." I said something agreeable, and we finished our coffee. I drove home, and I filed that conversation in the same place I filed everything else. The credulous column, respectfully labeled but not acted upon. That was about 10 years ago. I've thought about those words almost every day since last August.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
My wife Tara and I own 12 acres outside the community of Quinault. Quinault is a small, unincorporated settlement on the south shore of Lake Quinault. The lake is about 4 miles long and a couple wide, fed by the Quinault River coming down from the Olympics, and drained by the same river heading west toward Murchoch and the Pacific. Our property is about 4 miles east of the lake on a Forest Service road that dead-ends about 3 miles past our driveway. We're the last house before the road turns into a forest access track and then stops entirely at a locked gate. The Millers are a 1/4 mile west of us and have been there for 30 years. Beyond us and the Millers in the other direction there is nothing. No houses, no active homesteads, just the road, and then the gate, and then 50 miles of national park wilderness. The 12 acres are mixed second-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. This specific parcel was logged in the late 1940s, selectively, not clear-cut, so it wasn't stripped, but it was substantially cut. The timber standing now is 75, 80 years old in the oldest sections. Along the eastern boundary there's a creek drainage that runs year-round. The creek is called Cotter Creek, which is not on any USGS map. The family that sold us the property was the Cotter family, a ranch family that had been on the land from the 1920s through the 1980s, and they named the creek the way rural people name things when the place is theirs, and the naming doesn't need to be official to be functional. The creek runs clear 12 months a year. In winter, it goes high and fast. The Quinault Valley averages between 140 and 165 inches of annual rainfall depending on the monitoring station and the year. That's 12 to 14 feet of rain. It's one of the wettest places in the lower 48. By August, the creek drops to a trickle over exposed river cobble. But the riparian corridor along its banks stays green and thick even through the dry season. Salal, sword fern, red alder, growing dense at the margins, occasional patches of skunk cabbage in the seep areas where groundwater keeps the soil wet year-round, regardless of surface conditions. Directly east of our property, across Cotter Creek and into the National Forest, the terrain rises steeply onto a hillside that was protected in the 1938 Olympic National Park boundary expansion. This is the critical geographic fact. This hillside has been left alone since 1938. That's nearly 90 years of uninterrupted growth in 12 feet of annual rain on a north-northwest facing slope above a year-round creek. The trees on that slope are enormous, old Sitka spruce with trunks 6 feet across at the base, western red cedar with those wide, buttressed root systems that look like architecture, Douglas fir so large that standing at the base of them and looking up produces a specific kind of disorientation, like you've miscalculated the scale of something. The bark on these trees is furrowed 6 inches deep. The crowns disappear into a canopy so complete that the forest floor receives less than 5% of incident light on a typical overcast day. The nurse logs, downed old growth in various stages of decomposition, create a micro-terrain across the slope that a person navigating it has to read carefully. Some of those logs are 7-8 feet across before they've compressed down to the ground. The moss covers everything at depth. There are seeps that never dry, patches of devil's club 8 feet tall around the wet spots, big leaf maple growing along the creek margins in the horizontal, gravity-defying shapes that old maples develop when they've had decades of room. Animals, black bears, documented consistently by scat and claw marks on dead snags. Roosevelt elk, seasonal, using the slope between their high country summer range and the winter lowlands, with a wallow at the upper drainage that I've surveyed twice for the state. Black-tailed deer in the lower sections, especially along the creek margin where the browsing is better. River otters in Cotter Creek below the steeper section. I've counted 3 individuals using the creek as a travel corridor. In years, I've paid attention. Cougar, signed twice in 16 years, once a fresh scrape and cached deer carcass 600 yards above the creek, once a set of tracks in creek mud clear enough to photograph and identify. More bird species than I've counted, though the barred owl and the varied thrush and the winter wren are the ones I associate most specifically with that drainage in my memory. I know this hillside as well as any piece of ground I've worked in my career. I've been on it during every month of the year. I know where the elk wallow is and which season the bull elk use it. I know which seep never dries and which one goes intermittent in August. I know where the bears tend to work the berry patches in late summer and where the cougar left sign on the south-facing draw. I know it in the way that you know a place after 16 years of purposeful attention. Wren had grown up alongside my knowledge of that hillside. We'd been on it together enough times that she had her own version of that knowledge. Simpler than mine, lacking the technical taxonomy, but genuine. She could tell black bear scat from black-tailed deer scat. She knew what a fresh cougar scrape smelled like, because I'd shown her 1 year ago. She knew not to run from a bear, and she knew why. She knew what the elk wallow looked like during the rut, and she knew to stay upwind of it. The rules about Cotter Creek were, don't cross without a radio or a parent. Stay on the game trails where you can see where you're putting your feet. Make noise while you move. She'd heard that often enough to recite it and roll her eyes thus simultaneously. She also had Tugboat. Tugboat is a 7-year-old Chesapeake Bay retriever. A medium red coat, about 80 pounds, built for cold water and heavy brush, which is exactly what the Quinault watershed provides. He had been with us since he was a puppy, and Wren was 4 years old, and the relationship between them was the specific, complete bond that forms between certain dogs and certain children. Not the relationship of a pet and its owner, but more like fellow travelers who chose each other early. He would follow her anywhere. He'd shown that in practice enough times that it wasn't a question. Under normal circumstances, Tugboat was vocal about his opinions. He growled at deer in the yard, at the Muller family's truck on the road, at black bears that came to the compost pile 2 or 3 times a year. He growled at squirrels. He growled at herons that landed too close to the creek bank. He was a dog who expressed himself through sound, constantly and without embarrassment. This matters because of what he did and didn't do on August 9th. The morning of August 9th, Tara left for Amanda Park around 9 in the morning to do the weekly grocery run. Amanda Park is the small community at the southwest corner of Lake Quinault. Gas station, small grocery, the community center where the local fire department parks its equipment. About 20 minutes from our place, longer if the Forest Service road is wet and she needs to take it slow. I was running irrigation line from the wellhead to the kitchen garden, a project I'd been putting off since spring, which required a trench along the south edge of the property with the electric trenching shovel, about 200 yards from the house and well past easy shouting range. The shovel is loud. You can hear it at the house, but not clearly enough to distinguish words over it. Wren was home. August, midweek, nothing scheduled. Her instructions were to stay on our side of Cotter Creek. She didn't. She told me later, with that specific combination of guilt and defensiveness that 11-year-olds use when they've done something they knew was against the rules, but that led somewhere they can't quite regret, that she'd been watching the tree line on the far bank from the back porch, and she'd seen something moving in the old growth up the slope. Something dark, moving between trees at a height and speed that she didn't immediately categorize. She crossed Cotter Creek at the stepping stone ford we'd built years ago. Flat river cobble laid in a line across the August low-water flow, and went up the game trail on the far bank with Tugboat ahead of her. She had her pocket knife. She had rubber boots, because even at August, trickle the stepping stones put water at ankle level in sneakers. She had Tugboat. The game trail from the creek ford goes through a band of younger hemlock, second growth from private land cutting that happened before the park boundary was consistently enforced in this section. And then, about 100 yards above the creek, enters the old growth. The change is immediate when you cross that line. Cooler, darker, the light dropping to columns through gaps in the canopy. The trail narrows to the suggestion of a trail, which is still real and navigable if you know what you're reading. Decades of elk and deer movement through the same corridors. The vegetation trained by that repetition into something you can follow if you're paying attention. She went up maybe 300 yards from the creek. That's where she found the hare. It was on a branch of a vine maple at the edge of a small seep clearing, a flat spot where groundwater seeps keep the soil dark and wet year-round, and the skunk cabbage grows in dense clumps, and the ground is soft enough to take impressions. The branch was about 5.5 feet off the ground. Wren told me that evening the hair was reddish-brown, thick, a lot of it. Not a few strands, but a substantial tuft, like something large had pushed through that spot and left it. She said the color was deeper than deer, darker, and the texture was different from anything she'd touched before. She thought elk at first. There's a bull elk wallow about a 1/4 mile above that seep. Bull elk in late summer rub their antlers and bodies against vegetation and leave substantial amounts of hair behind. But elk hair is coarse and hollow, pale-tipped, and what Wren was describing and what I later found in her boot was not elk hair. She took some of it, tucked it in her boot for lack of pockets. That instinct to take a sample. I noticed it, and I was pleased by it even later, even after the context became what it became. She was being careful. She was paying attention. What she missed was what was paying attention to her. She took the hair from the vine maple branch and turned to look around the seep clearing, because she was curious about what had left it and whether there was more. She said the clearing was still and quiet. No elk, no birds in the immediate area, which she hadn't registered at the time as significant, but told me about later when she was thinking it through more carefully. No birds. She was used to the constant bird noise of that corridor. Winter wrens going in the undergrowth, song sparrows along the wet seep edges, brown creepers on the bark of the big trees. They were absent from the clearing while she was in it, which in retrospect is significant. She looked around for a minute or two. Nothing. Then she turned and started back down the trail. That's when Tugboat stopped. He'd been doing his normal ranging behavior on the way up. Ahead and back, the way a happy dog in good country covers 3 times the distance of the person walking with it. He'd been above her on the trail and come back down past her into the clearing, and then ahead again, and he was coming back toward her from above when he stopped on the trail about 30 feet above the seep and stood there looking upslope, ears forward, body low and still. Not the casual alert of a dog watching a deer. Something different. She knew his postures the way you know a dog's postures after years together, and this one she hadn't seen before. She called him down to her. He came, but at a walk, not a gallop, and when he reached her, he pressed himself against her left leg and stayed there. Did not make a sound. She stood in the middle of the seep clearing and she listened. What she heard was footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from above and to the left of the trail. Something moving through the brush with some audible evidence of its passage. Branches giving slightly, an occasional soft creak that might have been a root under weight, but not the crash and snap of something large and hurrying. Something being careful, something placing its feet with attention. The sound moved toward the trail, toward her position, and then stopped. Silence. She stood still. Tugboat was against her leg, pressing hard enough that she could feel him shaking slightly, the way he does sometimes when he's cold. It wasn't cold. She took a step down the trail. The sound in the brush above her started again immediately, a few steps, then stopping when she stopped. She tried this twice more. Move, and the thing in the brush moved. Stop, and it stopped. Maintaining the same position relative to her, not closing, not retreating. She turned and looked upslope into the brush. She almost didn't see it. It was standing behind a big hemlock about 60 feet above the trail, and the hemlock was wide enough that it was mostly invisible behind the trunk. What she noticed first was a vertical shape in the shadow that was the wrong color for bark. Not gray-green, warmer. Then it shifted its weight, a small adjustment, and she saw the arm. Long. She used that word 3 times when she described it to me. Long arm. Too long for how small it was. The arm was pressed against the hemlock trunk as the creature held on or leaned against it, and the hand where it gripped was dark against the pale bark. Wide palm, long fingers spread across the surface. She could see the spread of them even at 60 feet. The height she put at 4 feet, maybe 4.5, shorter than her. Wren was 5'2" last August, but the build was different from a child her size. Wider at the shoulders relative to its height, the torso dense. The head, at that distance and angle, looked narrow to her, or maybe long. She said the proportions were strange and she couldn't describe them precisely except as wrong relative to what she expected. The face was turned toward her. She couldn't see specific features at 60 feet in that light, but she saw the eyes. They reflected the ambient light that came down through the canopy gaps in the way that animal eyes do in low conditions. Not the bright pop of a direct flashlight beam, but a dim warmth, a reflectivity that registered as 2 distinct points in the shadow. And they were forward set, high on the face, forward set, watching her. It looked at her. She looked back, for a count of 5 seconds, approximately. Then it stepped back behind the hemlock and was gone. Completely. Instantly. Without a sound. She stood there with Tugboat against her leg, and she counted to 10, holding herself still. Then she turned and walked down the trail. She made herself walk. She told me afterward that she'd understood somewhere in that moment that running would be wrong, that the specific situation she was in called for walking and not running, though she couldn't have articulated why she thought so. It was instinct. It was right. The sounds in the brush to the left of the trail began again as she walked, keeping pace with her. 30 yards off, sometimes more, in undergrowth thick enough that she could hear movement without seeing the source. Twice she thought she caught a shape between tree trunks, a dark vertical form that matched her pace, and then disappeared behind the next trunk. Tugboat stayed pressed against her left leg the entire descent, making no sound. She could feel the tension in his body through her hand on his collar. She went down through the young hemlock, down the steep section, down to the bench above Cotter Creek. She stopped at the creek margin. The sounds in the brush stopped too. She stood there for a moment, listening to the creek and nothing else. Then she crossed the stepping stones to the south bank, the safe bank, our side. She turned and looked back. It was standing at the edge of the old-growth timber, just above the young hemlock stand, where the terrain flattens at the creek bench, about 80 yards from where she stood, in the open, not behind a tree, standing in the filtered light of the late afternoon with what she said was a completely still face. She used that phrase, specifically, a still face. Looking at her. She stood there looking at it for what she estimated was 10 seconds. She said she could see it more clearly in those 10 seconds than at any other point in the encounter. The proportions, the arms, the forward-leaning but upright posture, the width of the shoulders relative to the body. She said it did not look threatening. She said it looked like it was deciding something, and then it decided, and it stepped back into the trees. Gone. She heard my voice calling her name from down the slope below, and she ran toward it. I was calling her name because it was after 2 in the afternoon, and the house was empty when I went for a drink of water, and Tugboat's bowl on the porch was untouched, and the back door was standing open the way it does when you've left in a hurry and forgotten to close it. I'd spent a panicked 10 minutes walking the property perimeter and calling before I crossed the creek and started up the trail. She came down at a dead run with Tugboat bounding ahead of her, and the look on her face was something I've thought about a lot since. It wasn't pure fear. It wasn't relief either. Or not only relief. It was the face of a kid who'd had an experience that her existing categories weren't big enough to hold. I grabbed her by the shoulders. She was all right. She said she was all right. And then she looked back up the trail. She said, "Something was following me. Up there, something little, and it kept stopping when I stopped." I looked up the trail. Green, dense, nothing visible. The creek noise behind me. "What kind of little?" I said. She thought about it. "Like a person, but covered in fur, and its hands are big for how small it is." We stood there together for a moment. Then I took her hand and we walked back to the house. I made her tell me the whole story twice, over dinner. She was consistent in every detail both times, which is a habit she has and which I have always appreciated. After the second telling, I asked her questions I hadn't asked the first time. What did the eyes look like? She said warm, like a dog's eyes in the dark, but higher than a dog's eyes when it's standing on its back legs. What did the smell be like? She said nothing. She hadn't noticed a smell, which is one of the things I've thought about since. What did Tugboat do during the encounter? She described his behavior precisely. The frozen alert posture on the trail above the seep, the press against her leg, the silence all the way down. I asked her if she was scared. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "I was scared when I couldn't see it. When I could see it, I wasn't as scared." She went to bed. She turned the hall light on. She's left it on every night since. I waited until she was asleep, and then I went to the shed and got my headlamp, my field radio, my rubber boots, and my tape measure, and I crossed Cotter Creek in the dark. The old-growth hillside at night with a headlamp has its own specific quality. The canopy is so complete that no moonlight reaches the floor, and the headlamp beam turns everything it hits to bright green and throws everything else into absolute black. The nurse logs become walls. The gaps between the big trees become corridors. It is not a frightening place if you know it, but it is a place that takes your full attention. I went up the game trail to the seep clearing. I stood at the edge and played my light around the margins. The vine maple branch where Wren had found the hare was obvious. I went to it and examined it, compressed bark where something had pushed through, and on the downhill side of the branch, lower than Wren could reach, 2 additional tufts of hair she'd missed. I bagged them separately. On the soft substrate of the seep, which the groundwater keeps dark and saturated, I found tracks, bipedal. In a straight line, the pattern of a biped walking, not the paired, alternating pattern of a quadruped taking bipedal steps. My headlamp showed them clearly. The impressions deep in the dark soil, heel and toe distinct, with something between them that I mentally logged as foot. I needed daylight and a tape measure for proper documentation. I noted what I could see: the stride, the size relationship, the toe count, 5 toes, the outer toe relatively divergent, the heel impression narrow and oval. I went home and slept badly, and went back at first light with my measurement kit, longest print with clear edges, 9 3/4 inches, heel to tip of longest toe, width at widest point, 4 1/4 inches, stride length, heel of one print to heel of next, 31 inches, 6 clear prints in the line, then firmer substrate, where the seep drained. My own foot, for comparison, size 11 runs long on me, 11 1/4 inches, heel to toe. These prints were made by something with a shorter foot than mine, but with a stride close to mine while walking. Longer stride for the foot length than you'd expect from a small juvenile human, suggesting legs that were proportionally long for the body. And the plantar surface was different from mine. I couldn't see a clear medial arch loading pattern. The impression was even across the width in a way that suggested either a different arch structure or a foot that flexes differently than a human foot does. I photographed everything. Ruler in frame for scale, the correct protocol. I photographed the stick structure at the clearing margin that I found on my closer look. 3 sticks laid across a forked branch stub at chest height, in an arrangement that required placement, not accidental deposition. I photographed the vine maple branch. I photographed the clearing from multiple angles, and then I spent 2 days trying to replicate the tracks. This was my own null hypothesis test. If I can produce a matching track through some known process, the track's significance goes down. I tried my own bare feet. Wrong foot length, wrong arch loading pattern. I tried a carved wooden form. Couldn't get the toe impressions right. I tried improvised shoe modifications. Didn't match on multiple dimensions simultaneously. I couldn't reproduce all the features at the same time through any method I tried. I'm not claiming that proves what made them. I'm telling you what I tested. The hair from Wren's boot and from the vine maple branch. 9 intact strands from Wren's boot. 2 additional tufts from my own collection. I examined under my hand lens. 8 power, the one I use for invertebrate sorting. The strands were approximately 4 inches long, reddish-brown at the base, lightening slightly toward the tips, with a slight wave. The diameter was coarser than human hair, but finer than elk guard hair. No visible hollow medulla under the hand lens. Elk medulla is visible at 8 power. Color banding along the length, light, dark, light, similar to what you see in predator guard hair. Not elk, not bear, not cougar, not deer, not any domestic animal I could match it to. I have all of it in Ziploc bags in the top drawer of my field desk. I've had those bags in my hands more times than I can count. In the week after Wren's encounter, I called Ernie Sampson. I hadn't spoken to him since we'd been in the field together earlier in the summer, and I called his personal cell, not his work line, because this wasn't work, and I didn't want to have it in that context. I told him what had happened to Wren. He listened to the whole account without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "She saw a small one." I said yes. 4 feet, maybe. He said, "And it followed her all the way down." Yes. He was quiet for a moment. "They do that," he said. "The young ones, they're curious about human children. My grandfather said it's because the young ones don't know the rules yet. The adults stay back. The young ones haven't learned to." I asked him if he thought a juvenile would be alone up there, without adults. He was quiet for longer this time. Then, "Not usually. No, not unless something happened." I asked what he meant by something. He said, "Something to the family. The adults keep the young ones with them, if a young one's on its own that way. Curious enough to follow a human child for that long. There's usually a reason. Something changed in the family." We left it there. He didn't offer more, and I didn't push. Not usually alone, not unless something happened. I thought about that phrase for the next 3 weeks. Specifically, I thought about it while I was doing a salmon escapement survey in the lower section of the main tributary, where it runs through a narrow basalt gorge. The gorge is about 40 feet wide at the narrowest, 15 to 20 feet of relief from the water surface to the rim on both sides, vertical basalt. You access the lower survey stations through it on a game trail that drops down from the north rim at the upstream end and exits at a landing on the lower end. The channel through the gorge runs fast, even at low water, clear over bedrock and large boulders, cold. September, the first coho we're in. I was 100 yards into the gorge, wading in knee-deep in my chest waders, working the clipboard and counting gear, when I saw the carcass on the gravel bar inside a bend. The gravel bar was in 6 inches of slower water, where the current eddied on the inside of the curve. The first thing I saw was size and color. Something roughly the size of a large dog, partially submerged, the fur matted and wet and dark. My brain offered dog. My brain was wrong. I waded to the bar and stood looking at it. The arm was the thing that my brain couldn't resolve into any category. One forearm extended across the gravel, palm down, fingers spread slightly. Too long for the body by a margin that eliminated every domestic animal. Each finger, individually, too long relative to the palm. The hand at the end of the arm was wide across the palm, wide enough that my own hand held next to it later, in my memory of the comparison, seemed small. The fur, reddish-brown, matted with water and gravel, but the color visible where the longer guard hairs caught the light. The same color as the hair in the Ziploc bags in my desk drawer. The face was submerged, turned away from me. I did not turn it over. I stood on that gravel bar in the cold-moving water of the gorge, and I made a series of decisions that I've lived with since. I photographed it, 6 photographs, before my hands were shaking too much to hold the camera steady. The photographs show the body, the extended arm, the general size and fur color, the position on the bar. The visible torso length alone, with the knees drawn up and one arm extended, suggested something substantially above 5 feet when laid out. This was not the 4-foot juvenile that followed my daughter down from the seep clearing. This was larger. The fur on the shoulder was thick, even wet, and the depth of the coat where I could see it on the torso was substantial. An adult. The Quinault Valley gets multi-day rain events in late summer. There had been a significant rain event in late July. I know this because I have weather data for the drainage from the WDFW monitoring station. A heavy late July rain event pushes volume through the upper tributary and the gorge within a day or two. A flood surge in that gorge moves a lot of material. including large material. Anything caught in the gorge during a surge event would be moved, deposited on gravel bars downstream, or moved further depending on the volume. The gravel bar inside the gorge bend is the first significant depositional feature downstream of the upper sections of the main tributary. The timing, Wren's encounter, was August 9th. I found the carcass in early September, 3 weeks later. Late July flood event, something alone on the upper tributary or in the gorge during a surge. A juvenile that was suddenly, as of some point in late July or early August, without an adult. I did not report it. I am a state wildlife official. I understand the reporting protocol. I have thought every day about the decision I made on that gravel bar. What I've arrived at, through months of thinking about it, is this. There is a version of a formal report on a carcass in that drainage that serves the thing living on that hillside, and there is a version that does not. The version that does not involve a formal notification process, a subsequent investigation, the physical disturbance of a corridor that currently has no human presence in it, and a documentation pathway that eventually reaches people who will want to study what they find. That will happen eventually anyway. I know that, but I made the choice to not be the mechanism for it. I've accepted that choice, and I'm still making it. I went home, and I told Tara. She listened to everything. When I was done, she said, "That's why it followed her." Yes. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Eventually, Tara said, "Do you think it knows she came home?" I didn't have an answer. I've thought about that question every day since. I went back to the gorge 2 days later on a day off. The gravel bar was empty. Depression in the gravel, some compressed vegetation at the bar margin. Gone. Whether by water or bears or ravens or something else, I don't know. On the game trail coming out of the gorge on the north bank, I found a structure behind a large alder root mass that I'd walked past without seeing on the way in because it was slightly off the trail and the light was bad. Sticks laid across a fork in the root system at about shoulder height on me, larger and more carefully constructed than the one at the seep clearing. At the base of the alder, in the saturated soil, one bipedal impression. 14.5 inches, heel to longest toe, 4 3/4 inches wide, adult-sized. I photographed it and left everything alone. I walked out of the gorge and drove home. I called a wildlife biologist named Gary Wesson about a week after finding the carcass. Gary is a former large mammal habitat assessment specialist who retired from institutional work several years ago and now works independently, compiling and analyzing encounter reports from the Pacific Northwest. I'd found his work through a citation chain in some fisheries literature. He'd published on coastal salmon recovery in the 1990s, and I'd followed the chain until I found what he was doing now. His methodology is the most rigorous I've encountered outside of institutional settings. He applies the same standards to account quality that he'd apply to wildlife survey data. Detail, internal consistency, witness profile, corroboration. I called him and described what Wren had experienced without giving him the context of the carcass, because I wanted to hear his read on the juvenile behavior first. He was quiet after I finished, and then he said, "The following behavior is consistent with what comes up in the better documented reports from the Pacific Northwest. There are at least a dozen accounts in my records that I'd rate as high credibility, where a juvenile is observed tracking a human, usually a child, at maintained distance over an extended period. It doesn't look like predatory behavior in any of those accounts. It doesn't read as territorial either. The best wildlife analogy I've found is the investigative curiosity behavior you see in young great apes, young gorillas, young chimps. They're drawn to novel stimuli. They'll approach a human observer who isn't threatening, maintain distance, observe, and sometimes follow. It's investigative social behavior. I asked him what he thought would cause a juvenile to be engaging in that behavior alone. He said, "Juveniles don't typically operate independently in the accounts I have. When they're observed alone, it's usually in the context of a family group disruption, a mortality event, a separation." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you what to look for, but I think you should pay close attention to the drainage in the next few weeks. The physical evidence sometimes follows." The physical evidence followed 3 weeks later. After I found the carcass, I called Gary again and told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dale, that's the third case in my records over 20 years where a juvenile encounter was temporally correlated with an adult mortality event in the same drainage. In 2 of those cases, there was direct physical evidence of the mortality. The third was inferential." He said, "Document everything. Don't report it yet. Watch the corridor. Tell me what you find." I've been watching the corridor for 7 months now. My field journal for the 4 months following August 9th runs to 47 pages of sign notes, photographs, and location data. I've mapped every data point, track impressions, stick structures, instances of that specific smell, vocal events, the cessation of bird vocalization. The sign forms a corridor. It runs from the seep clearing on the hillside east of our property, up the Cotter Creek drainage along the east-facing slope, to the ridge, and then based on the northernmost sign I've documented, it drops into the next tributary system to the north, which is part of the Quinault River corridor. This corridor represents somewhere between 4 and 6 square miles of old-growth and old-growth adjacent national park forest. Well-watered, remote, canopied, with abundant ungulate prey and no regular human access, a range, a territory, an area that something moves through consistently enough to leave sign at specific, repeated locations. What I've documented in 4 months, 2 additional sets of large bipedal impressions at survey sites in the upper tributary, a tree break at approximately 13 feet on a snag near the Elk Wallow, twisted off rather than sheared, inconsistent with wind failure, 3 instances of the smell in the half-mile corridor above Cotter Creek, 1 additional stick structure at the upper tributary, larger and more complex than either of the previous ones, 2 instances of directional bird vocalization suppression, lasting approximately 10 minutes each. I need to explain the smell because it's the thing I've had the hardest time describing in my field journal. The first time I encountered it was in September of the year before Wren's encounter, at a survey site on the upper tributary about a mile above the creek confluence. I noted it as strong animal odor, source unknown. I know what black bear smells like. I know what elk smell like when there's a herd nearby. That grassy hay-like musk that a big bull in rut intensifies into something sharper. I know what a cougar kill smells like, blood and the specific rot of a partially cached carcass. I know what a wet Chesapeake Bay retriever smells like, which is considerable. What I smelled at that survey site was none of those things. It was heavy, musky in a way that didn't have an exact equivalent in any animal scent I knew. A base musk, thick, animal, but not identifiable as any specific animal. Underneath the musk, something sour, not rotting exactly, more like an active fermentation, the way certain mushrooms smell when they're going off, or the way a beaver lodge smells when you get close to it in summer. And something underneath even that, something that sat in the back of my throat after I breathed it and stayed there for 20 minutes. I wrote in my field journal, strong animal odor, source unknown. That is one of the most inadequate notations in 16 years of field work. Since August, I've smelled it 3 more times in the corridor, each time in late afternoon, when the humidity was high and the wind had dropped. Each time upslope from where I was standing. Each time associated with the directional quieting of the bird activity around me. I contacted Dr. Judith Halverson at the University of Washington in October. Dr. Halverson is a conservation biologist with a focus on large mammal habitat assessment in the Olympic Peninsula ecosystem. I'd found her through a citation trail in the peer-reviewed fisheries literature. She'd co-authored a paper that cited WDFW data from our district, which gave me a professional 1-degree connection. I sent her the seep clearing track photograph with ruler in frame, one of the stick structure photographs, a general slope terrain photograph. I described them as unusual sign from routine survey work and asked for a second opinion on the track photograph specifically. She responded in about a week. Her response was careful and measured. She said the track photograph was interesting, that the stride length I'd measured was inconsistent with any species she was aware of in the Olympic Peninsula ecosystem at that foot size, and that she'd want higher resolution images to say anything more definitive. She asked for the measurement notes. I sent them. She was quiet for a week. Then she wrote, "I'm going to be direct with you. I've had 3 prior contacts over the past 8 years from colleagues who sent me sign from the Olympic Peninsula or the Cascades that I couldn't account for using known species. Your track measurements are in a range that appears in 2 of those 3 previous cases. I'm not going to characterize what I think this means because I don't think that serves either of us professionally. What I will say is that if you're inclined to continue systematic documentation of sign in this corridor, I'd be interested in what you find." She did not say the word. She didn't need to. But a credentialed wildlife biologist with a university appointment had seen sign of this kind before and had not dismissed it. That is a fact I return to regularly. In December, I had a direct sighting. Let me be precise. I was doing a winter low-flow survey on the upper tributary in the old-growth section on a gray December morning. The kind of morning on the peninsula where the light never fully comes up, everything dripping, the world the color of wet concrete and deep green. I was working alone at a kicknet riffle station, sorting invertebrates in the white tray, both hands occupied, my attention on the sample. A varied thrush called from the east bank. One call, the 2-note tone, and then silence. I looked up. On the east bank, approximately 50 yards upstream, something was standing at the creek margin at the tree line of the old growth, standing upright, dark-furred, the reddish-brown visible even in the poor light. 7 feet, approximately. I know how imprecise that estimate is at that distance with a poorly defined background, wide at the shoulders, the arms hanging lower than a person's arms would hang. The posture slightly forward, the head slightly forward of the vertical, a lean that a person doesn't have but that fit the proportions I was looking at. The face was turned toward me. I couldn't see features at that distance, in that light, but I could see that it was watching me, not moving, just standing at the creek margin in the December morning watching me sort invertebrates. I looked at it looked at me, 4 seconds, maybe 5, then it stepped back into the old growth and was gone. No sound, not a branch snap, not a splash, not a footfall on the cobble. Gone. I stood by the creek for a long time. The varied thrush started again from somewhere in the east bank timber. A winter wren began its long, furious song from the undergrowth on my side. The sounds came back. I packed my sampling equipment and walked to my truck on the Forest Service road. I sat in the truck and opened my field journal and I wrote, "Adult-sized bipedal subject observed, 0914 hours, east bank approximately 50 meters upstream of Station 4, upper tributary survey corridor. Duration of observation approximately 5 seconds. Subject departed east into old-growth canopy without audible sign. Varied thrush resumed vocalization approximately 90 seconds post-departure. Then I drove home. 16 years in this drainage. That was the first direct sighting, 5 seconds at 50 yards in bad December light. I didn't report it. I want to come back to Ernie, because I spoke to him a second time in November, and that conversation has stayed with me in a particular way. I told him about the carcass, all of it. The location, the arm, the fur color, the size relative to what Wren had described, the timing. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "The small one is still there." It wasn't a question. I said yes, based on the sign corridor I'd been documenting. He said, "Then it's all right." I asked what he meant. He said, "They take care of their own. When something happens to one of them, when a family loses someone, the others in the group take care of what's left behind. It might take time, but something went looking for it after your daughter saw it. Something noticed the small one wasn't where it should be." I said, "How long does that take?" He said, "Depends on what happened and where the group is and how far they have to travel. Could be weeks, could be months, but they don't leave the young ones." He paused. Then he said, "Your daughter saw it on its own. That was its worst time. That's probably why it came so close to her. Too close, following that long. It was alone and it didn't know what to do." Another pause. "It's better now." I thanked him and we hung up. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. Wren and I have been talking about all of this more gradually since October. She's been doing her own research, the way 11-year-olds with internet access do research, which is thorough in some directions and patchy in others. But she's been taking it seriously and she has opinions. One evening in November, over dinner, she said, "I read that they're really smart." I said, "Some people think so, yes." She said, "Smarter than animals." I said, "Some of the accounts suggest that." She thought about this, eating her dinner. Then she said, "Then it knew I wasn't going to hurt it." I said, "How do you figure that?" She said, "Because I didn't do anything that would seem threatening. I just walked. I didn't try to get closer. I didn't make loud noises. I didn't throw anything. So it knew I was okay." She ate some more. And I think it was young enough that it was curious anyway. Like it knew the rules said stay away, but it was too interested to listen. I said, "What rules do you mean?" She said, "The rules about not letting people see them. The adults follow those." It didn't. She looked at me. Because it was young and it was alone, and it didn't know what else to do. 11 years old, processing this more coherently than most adults I know would. I asked her if she was scared now, looking back. She thought about it carefully, the way she thinks about things she wants to get right. Then, "No, I feel like it needed something, and I was there, and I didn't hurt it." And then it went back to where it lives. She paused. "I hope it's okay." That was in November. In February, she told me, "I want to go back to the seep clearing. Not alone. With me." She wanted to go back and see the place again. I said, "In the spring, when the creek drops a bit more." She said, "Okay." She's been patient about it. I want to try to describe what I've come to understand about why the juvenile followed her, because I've thought about it from every angle I can find, and I want to put it down clearly. A juvenile, young enough that the behavioral inhibitions around human contact hadn't fully developed, and young enough to be intensely curious, was alone on that hillside for a period between late July, when I believe the adult was lost in the flood event, and whenever the rest of the group found it and took it in. Ernie said weeks or months. The encounter with Wren was August 9th, about 2 weeks after the late July rain event. The juvenile was in the acute period of that aloneness. It saw Wren from above on the trail, a human child, alone except for a dog, moving through its territory, not threatening. She wasn't making alarming sounds or moving aggressively. She was just walking and looking at things the way an interested child walks through interesting terrain. The dog was unusual. The dog went quiet, and pressed itself against her, which is an unusual behavior that might have registered as non-threatening, might have registered as the dog acknowledging something the juvenile didn't expect to be acknowledged. It followed her, because following was the behavior available to it. A juvenile with its group would spend time in proximity to other members, learning, observing, being in contact. Without the group, that need for proximity, for being close to something that was present and real and not threatening, was redirected at the only available subject, which was a human child walking down a familiar trail. It maintained 30 yards. That's not nothing. That's a deliberate distance, not just the distance that happened. A juvenile that was operating purely on curiosity without any restraint would likely have come closer. The 30 yards says something about what it understood about the situation. It showed itself at the tree line. That was a choice. It had been careful not to be seen clearly for 40 minutes on that trail. At the creek bank, it stepped into the open for 10 seconds. What do you do when something you've been watching is about to be gone? You let it see you. You make the contact mutual for a moment before it ends. I've thought about that a lot. Whether that's projection, whether I'm reading into the behavior of something I can't fully understand by applying a framework that doesn't fit. Maybe. I can't rule it out. But the behavior sequence, concealment, maintained distance, following, then stepping into the open at the last possible moment, has a logic to it that I can't fully explain away as coincidence or random animal movement. Something wanted to be seen before she left. March now. The creek is up from the February rains, but starting to drop as the mild weather holds. The old-growth hillside across the water is the same color of deep green it's always been. The rain keeps it green year-round. That's the nature of a temperate rainforest. The barred owls are calling more in the evenings as the days lengthen. I can hear them from the kitchen window when the wind is right. I've been adding to the field journal since December. The sign in the corridor is ongoing. I found a new set of tracks in late February in the upper tributary mud after a rain event. Large bipedal impressions in the silty substrate of the inside bend. Adult-sized, 14 inches, stride length of 53 inches. Running stride, I estimated, from the depth of the heel strike relative to the toe. Something moving at speed through the upper corridor in the rain. I photographed it and left it. I haven't talked to Gary Wesson since February. I'm planning to send him the accumulated documentation from the full 7 months when I have it organized. He'll know what to do with it in terms of comparative analysis with the cases in his records. Dr. Halvorsen hasn't followed up, and I haven't either. That relationship is where I left it. I'm not ready to have that conversation go further in an institutional direction. Someday it might have to be. There are things I haven't been able to resolve. The responsible state wildlife official in me knows there's a pathway for this evidence. A pathway that would put these photographs and measurements and field notes in front of people equipped to do something with them, scientifically. I know the BFRO formal report process. I know there are geneticists who've published on hair samples from alleged encounter sites. I know there are wildlife biologists who take this seriously and who would treat what I have with rigor. I've thought about all of it. Every time I get close to following any of those paths, I think about the 4 to 6 square mile corridor east of Cotter Creek. The old growth that's been left alone since 1938. The thing that Ernie said about paying attention in a way that isn't bad. I think about what formal scientific attention to that corridor would look like in practice. The trail cameras, the tracking hardware, the monitoring infrastructure, and I think about the 2 salmon population assessments I've been part of, where monitoring infrastructure went in and the target wildlife went quiet for months after. Whatever is in the old growth east of Cotter Creek has more behavioral flexibility than a salmon population, and I believe substantially more awareness of what monitoring infrastructure represents. Any formal investigation of that corridor would be noticed before it produced useful data. I'm not saying that's a reason to never do it. I'm saying it's a reason not to do it yet. Not while things are as they are. Not while the corridor is quiet in the way it's been quiet, and the sign is what it's been, and I'm the only one paying the kind of attention I've been paying. And there's one more thing that I haven't quite named yet, which is this. Whatever is in that core has coexisted with human activity in this drainage for at least as long as the humans who've been tracking it have been tracking it, which is to say at least as long as the Quinault tribal record, which goes back farther than any written record in this region. It's been here. It's been paying attention to this watershed from its side of the boundary, in the same way that I've been paying attention to it from my side. Ernie's grandfather knew that. Ernie knows it, and I know it now, in the particular way you know something when it has become part of your direct experience rather than inherited belief. There's something in that old growth that saw a child and followed her home without hurting her, that maintained a careful distance for 40 minutes, that let her see it at the creek edge before stepping back, that placed a structure near the site where an adult had died, and that may have come looking for a young one that was lost. I'm not in a hurry to disrupt whatever the arrangement is. I'm paying attention. I'm leaving food. I'm documenting what I find, and I'm treating the corridor with the same care I'd apply to any sensitive habitat where something rare was living. That might be the wrong approach. I've accepted that. It's the approach I've got. Wren walks tugboat to the creek bank in the evenings, not across, just to the bank. She stands there and looks at the old-growth hillside with the dog beside her, and then after a while she turns and comes back to the house. I've watched her do this from the kitchen window more times than I can count. She stands there patiently, unhurried, looking at the dark timber on the far bank. Tugboat stands beside her, loose and easy, ears relaxed, watching the water. She's going to want to cross that creek in April. She's already decided. The question in her mind is not whether but when, and she's being patient about the when because she understands that I need the creek lower and the light better before we go up that slope together. When she comes back to the house from the creek bank, I usually ask her if she saw anything. She always says, "Nothing, just looking." But she lingers a while before she turns around. I think about what Ernie said. They know the difference between someone who's just passing through and someone who's staying. We're staying. We've always been staying. And I think whatever is in that forest knows that now, in a way, it didn't know before. Because an 11-year-old stood on a hillside and didn't run, and a dog pressed against her leg instead of barking, and something young and alone watched them and followed them, and then let them go. There's a word for what that is. I don't know that it's a word I'm equipped to use given what I know and what I don't know, but it feels like the beginning of something. I don't know what. I just know it started on August 9th, on a hillside, in the rainforest, with a child and a dog and something small that was watching from behind a hemlock, a long way from home, in the specific way that something is a long way from home when the person it should be with is gone. Whatever it is now, wherever it is, whoever found it, whether Ernie was right and the group came for it, eventually. I hope it's okay. Wren said that first, back in November. I find myself thinking it too. I hope it's okay. I want to tell you about the Quinault drainage more specifically, because it's the context for everything else, and I don't think I've done it justice yet. The Quinault River starts up near the Olympic Mountains, draining the southern flanks of a range that rises to nearly 8,000 feet from sea level in a horizontal distance of about 40 miles. The snowpack up high feeds the river through summer when everything else in the lowlands is dry. By August, the river is clear green over the cobble in the lower sections, colder than you'd expect for August, even in this latitude, because the headwaters are still running off glacial melt from the permanent snowfields above the tree line. The valley itself is wider than you'd expect, given how quickly the mountains rise on either side. The Quinault Indian Nation has land on the western section of the valley. The Lake Quinault area where the lodge sits is technically inside the reservation boundary on the south side. Olympic National Park takes the eastern and northern sections, extending up to the high country and over the divide into the Elwha drainage to the north and the Queets and Quinault drainages to the west and south. The patchwork of land ownership, tribal, federal park, national forest, private parcels going back to homestead claims, creates a management complexity that people who only see the region from outside don't fully appreciate. What it means in practice for the old growth east of our property, it's national park land, which means no timber harvest has been permitted on it since the park was established. The western Olympic Peninsula was not fully included in the park in its original 1938 boundaries. There was political pressure from timber interests, and the initial boundary protected the high country but left significant amounts of the Western Valley old growth outside it. The Quinault old growth got better protection in subsequent boundary adjustments, the most significant being in the 1950s when a series of old-growth stands on the southern drainages were added to the park. The hillside, directly east of our property, was in the 1938 designation. It's been protected for 87 years. In a valley where the logging that happened in the 1940s through 1960s took the timber off hundreds of thousands of acres, this specific slope is one of the remnants. You can see the difference from our property on a clear day. The tree line on the slope east of us is taller, denser, the crowns bigger, the skyline ragged with the irregular tops of old growth, rather than the uniform height of the planted second growth to the west. The Roosevelt elk that use that slope are the same elk I've been counting in my surveys for 16 years. Roosevelt elk on the Olympic Peninsula are a specific subspecies, the largest subspecies of elk in North America, with mature bulls reaching 800 pounds or better. The herd that uses the Cotter Creek corridor has been documented in WDFW records since the 1970s, and my survey data extends back through my full time in the district. They're not numerous. A typical group using the slope in the late summer before they push to higher ground. For the rut is 3 to 8 animals, occasionally more. They use the old growth slope for shade and cover, the creek margin for water, and they're on the valley floor and the low elevation browse areas in the early morning and evening. I've been watching these elk for 16 years. I know when the group count is right and when it isn't. In the late summer of the year before Wren's encounter, I noticed the elk using the Cotter Creek corridor were running consistently lower numbers than I'd seen in prior years. 2 or 3 animals where I'd typically expect 4 to 6. Their behavior on the slope was also different in a specific way that I filed away without acting on at the time. They weren't using the upper section of the slope above the seep, clearing the way they'd used it in prior years. The wallow is up there, and the browse is good up there, and the elk usually use it in the summer rotation. In the summer before Wren's encounter, they weren't going up there. I noticed this at the time. I noted it as a possible indicator of cougar pressure in the upper section. I did one additional cougar sign survey up there and didn't find anything fresh, so I moved on. Looking back now, I think the elk were responding to something that had moved into the upper section of the corridor, something they didn't want to be around. Elk are sensitive to predator presence in ways that get expressed in space use. They avoid areas where a significant predator is operating, sometimes for extended periods after the predator has moved on. The avoidance isn't just of the predator itself. It's of the territory the predator has made its own. The upper section of the Cotter Creek corridor, above the seep clearing and toward the ridge, is the area where the sign concentration in my post-August documentation is highest. If whatever made those tracks had been using that section as its primary range in the year before Wren's encounter, it would explain the elk behavior. And if the elk behavior started in the year before and has continued, which it has, the elk are still running lower numbers in the upper section, then the presence in that corridor goes back farther than Wren's August 9th encounter by at least a year. That's a minimum of 2 years of a resident presence in a specific corridor. Ernie's grandfather said they know the difference between someone just passing through and someone who's staying. 2 years of residency in a 4 to 6 square mile corridor of protected old growth is not just passing through. There is one more thing I want to document here, something that happened in January that I haven't told Gary Wesson about yet, and haven't told Ernie about, and have only told Tara. I was coming back from a survey station in the late afternoon, about 3:30, the light already going gray-blue the way it goes in January in this valley. I'd parked on the Forest Service road near the gate that's about a mile from our property, and I was walking the road back to the truck after checking the lower Cotter Creek confluence. The road at that point runs through a band of alder and red osier dogwood along the creek margin, and in January the alder has dropped its leaves, and you can see through the branches at the flat bottom of the creek, and the riparian strip and the slope rising on the far side. I was about 100 yards from the truck when I heard something in the alder stand to my left. Not loud, a branch giving, something moving through the brush at the elevation of the alder canopy, which at that stretch is maybe 12-15 feet off the ground. I stopped. Silence. Then, from the alders about 30 feet to my left, something dropped, landed on the gravel road surface, 2 feet, bipedal, and came upright in a single motion. It was about 40 feet from me. I had a moment, one clear moment, before it was gone. I was looking at its back, because it had landed facing the road bank and was already moving toward the slope when I registered what I was seeing. Roughly 4.5 feet in height, reddish-brown fur that caught the January light, long arms that swung wide as it ran. It went up the road bank and into the brush on the slope side in about 3 seconds and was gone. I stood on the road for a long time. The juvenile. 4 feet when Wren saw it in August, 4.5 now in January, 5 months later, growing. I walked to where it had landed and looked at the gravel. The road surface in that section has a layer of fine gravel on top of packed base, and in the accumulated winter damp, the fine gravel holds impressions. I could see the landing marks, 2-foot impressions in the gravel where it came down from the alder, close together, the impact depth considerably more than a walking impression. I could see the stride marks going up the road bank, bipedal, long, the distance between them wider than the seep clearing measurements I'd taken in August. I didn't measure them. I had my tape measure in my vest, but I was shaking enough that I couldn't have held it steady, and the light was going, and I needed to be at the truck before full dark. I drove home and I told Tara, and we sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She said, "It's okay, it's still here." Yes, still here. 5 months later and 4.5 feet instead of 4. Growing in a corridor it knows, in old growth it grew up in a watershed that the rain has been growing trees in for a very long time. Whatever family found it, wherever they went, it's still here, and I think it knows where we are. It's March. Wren is on spring break this week. She's been asking every day whether we can go to the seep clearing. I said, "Maybe this weekend." She said, "You've been saying that?" She's right. I have been saying that. I've been careful about the timing because I want the creek lower and the light right, and I want to think through what we're going into before we go into it. But I've also been putting it off because I'm not sure what's right about going back up there, about taking her up there, about what that means in the context of the year we've had. She said last Thursday, at breakfast, we're not going to hurt it. And it knows that. That's why it let me see it. I said, what makes you think it would still be there? She said, because where would it go? It lives there. She's right about that, too. We're going Sunday. I've got the field kit ready. Her rubber boots are by the door. Tugboat is going to lose his mind the entire way up the trail, because that's what Tugboat does. I don't know what we'll find. I don't know if we'll find anything. The corridor sign has been consistent since August, but sign is not a sighting, and the January road encounter was brief and at its back, and I'm not sure what it registered as in its awareness. Probably just the person who's been in the creek all year, the one who leaves food at the structures sometimes. Maybe that's enough. Ernie said, you've been in this drainage long enough that they've seen you plenty by now, probably more than you know. 16 years. The salmon surveys, the tributary walks, the escapement counts, the low-flow assessments, the winter surveys, the spring smolt monitoring. All of it in the same corridor, year after year, the same person moving through the same watershed in a predictable pattern, reliable and non-threatening, part of the landscape's regular rhythm. Maybe what changed last August wasn't the first time something on that hillside noticed me. Maybe it was the first time one of them was young enough and alone enough and curious enough to act on what it had observed over years. And maybe what's different now is that we've both seen each other. We've both acknowledged the other's presence in this place. We're both still here. That seems like the beginning of something. I don't know what it's the beginning of. But Wren wants to go back to the seep clearing. And I think she should. And I think we'll go Sunday. And I think whatever is in that old growth has known we were coming back for a while now. Some things take time to understand. Some things take years of being in the right place before the understanding is possible. 16 years. I think we're getting somewhere. I came home and made dinner and helped Wren with her math and watched something on TV. I don't remember, and waited until Wren was in bed. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my field journal and wrote down what I'd found as accurately as I could. Location, condition, the measurements I'd been able to make visually, the photographs, the arm and the hand, and the color of the fur. Then I closed the journal. Tara came in for a glass of water and looked at my face the way she's looked at my face for 15 years when she knows something has happened that I haven't told her yet. She sat down across from me. She said, "What did you find today?" I told her everything, the carcass, the arm, the fur color, the size, the timing, what it suggested, and what I thought it meant. When I was done, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "That's why it followed her." Yes, that's what I think. The juvenile on the hillside east of Cotter Creek was alone. The adult I'd found on the gravel bar in the gorge was the reason it was alone. Whether they were family in the specific sense, mother and young, or something analogous to that, I don't know, so I can't know. But the behavior pattern Wren described, and the timing, and the location of the carcass, downstream from the territory I've been documenting, adds up to something. An 11-year-old with her dog in the old growth, a juvenile something watching her from a careful distance for 40 minutes, a small creature that was curious and keeping its distance but not leaving even when she walked all the way back to the creek and crossed to the far bank. Tara sat there for a while and then she said, "Do you think it knows she came home?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. But I've thought about that question every single day since. I went back to the gorge 2 days later on a day off, not a scheduled survey, so there was no paperwork implication to the visit. The gravel bar was empty. The depression in the gravel was there, and some matted vegetation at the bar margin that could have been incidental or could have been from a large body resting on it. The body was gone. The August late-season flush can move material if another rain event pushes through, and bears and ravens and river otters work those gravel bars constantly. A carcass on an exposed bar in a gorge accessible to bears from the rim has a limited window. On my way back up the gorge on the North Bank Game Trail, I found something I'd walked past without seeing on the way in. It was slightly off the trail behind a large alder root mass at about shoulder height. A structure of sticks laid across a fork in the root mass, larger than the one I'd found at the seep clearing. More sticks, more carefully arranged, placed at about my shoulder height, which is 5'10". The sticks were dry and the moss beneath them showed compression, suggesting they'd been in place for some time. At the base of the alder, in the soft soil, there was a single bipedal impression, one print, deep. The substrate was saturated enough to take a clear impression of both heel and forefoot, and the impression went down about 1.5 inches. Toe impressions partially visible, and this track was substantially larger than the ones I'd measured at the seep clearing. I taped it at 14.5 inches heel to longest visible toe, 4 3/4 inches wide at the forefoot. I photographed it and left it alone. I walked back out of the gorge. In the weeks following, I tried, carefully and methodically, to disprove my own read on the seep clearing tracks. This is not standard practice in cryptid research, but it's standard practice in field biology. You design your most aggressive null hypothesis and then test it. I spent 2 days trying to produce an impression in seep clearing type substrate that matched all of the following simultaneously: the stride length of 31 inches, the foot length of 9 3/4 inches, the narrow heel impression, the blunt toe impressions with the divergent outer toe, and the lack of visible medial arch loading. I tried my own bare feet. The stride matched, but the foot length was all wrong, and my arch loads the midfoot in a way that shows clearly in the impression. I tried a carved wooden form. I couldn't get the toe impressions right. I tried using my boot with the insole removed, stepping in a deliberate shuffle. Didn't match on any dimension. I couldn't reproduce all the features simultaneously through any method I tried. I'm not claiming that proves anything. I'm telling you what I was able to replicate and what I wasn't. October came. The salmon came back to Cotter Creek the way they always do. Coho moving up from the estuary, running up through the lower side drainage and into the tributary system that Cotter Creek feeds. There's something that happens to me every October in this drainage that I've never been able to fully articulate to people who haven't worked in anadromous fish habitat. The whole riparian system shifts when the salmon arrive. The dippers start working the shallow riffles. The ravens move down from the ridges to the creek margins. The bears come down from the high country. The nutrient pulse from spawning and dying salmon feeds the entire corridor. The trees, the insects, the songbirds, the mammals, and everything downstream of the spawning grounds gets that pulse even years down the road in the growth rings of the riparian vegetation. The salmon are not just fish. They're the mechanism that keeps this whole connected system alive. Whatever lives in the old-growth hillside east of Cotter Creek lives in that system. It breathes the same marine-influenced air that piles against the Olympics and drops as rain. It drinks from the same watershed, it hunts the same elk corridors, probably, and eats the same salmon, maybe, that I count every fall. It has been doing that for a long time. Longer than the trees I work in, maybe longer than the current configuration of the watershed. In October, I sent photographs to Dr. Judith Halvorsen at the University of Washington. Dr. Halvorsen is a conservation biologist with a focus on large mammal habitat assessment in the Olympic Peninsula ecosystem. I'd found her through a peer-reviewed paper she'd co-authored that cited WDFW survey data from our district, which gave me a 1-degree professional connection. I sent her the seep clearing track photograph, one of the stick structure photographs, and a general terrain photograph. I described them briefly as unusual sign I'd found during routine survey work and asked for a second opinion. She responded in about a week. Her response was careful. She said the track photograph was interesting, that she'd need higher resolution images to say anything definitive, and that the stride length I'd described was inconsistent with any species she was aware of in the Olympic Peninsula ecosystem at that foot size. She asked for more detail. I sent the measurement notes. She was quiet for a week. Then she wrote back and said, "I'm going to be direct with you. In the past 8 years, I've had 3 prior contacts where colleagues sent me track sign from the Olympic Peninsula or the Cascades that I couldn't account for through known species. Your photograph puts you in a range that appears in 2 of those cases. I'm not going to characterize what I think that means because I don't think it would help either of us professionally. But if you're inclined to continue documenting sign in that corridor, I'd be interested in seeing what you find." A credentialed wildlife biologist with a university appointment who has encountered this kind of sign before, and who, carefully, did not dismiss it. That fact has mattered to me. I've continued documenting. My field journal for the 4 months following August 9th runs to 47 pages of sign notes, photographs, and location data. I've mapped the sign locations, and they form a corridor running roughly north-northeast from the seep clearing on the old-growth hillside east of our property, up the Cotter Creek drainage, along the east-facing slope to the ridge, and then dropping, based on the northernmost sign location I've found, into the next tributary system to the north, which is part of the Quinault River corridor. That corridor represents somewhere between 4 and 6 square miles of old-growth and old-growth adjacent forest, heavily canopied, well-watered, abundant ungulates, remote from any regular human access, and protected from disturbance by its national park status since 1938. A territory, something that lives somewhere within it. In those 4 months, I've found 2 additional sets of large bipedal impressions at survey sites in the upper tributary, a second tree break at a different location, a snag with the upper section twisted and broken at approximately 13 feet in a manner inconsistent with wind failure, 3 instances of that smell at locations within a half-mile corridor along the east-facing slope. The same smell I'd noted twice in the year before Wren's encounter, that heavy, sour musk that sits in the back of the throat. 1 additional stick structure at the upper tributary, larger and more complex than the one I'd found at the gorge, and 2 instances of what I described in my field notes as unexplained cessation of ambient bird vocalization, directional, approximately 10 minutes duration. That last one needs some explanation. The cessation of ambient animal vocalization in the presence of something that produces that effect is one of the more commonly reported sensory phenomena in encounter accounts. I'd always filed that particular detail in the skeptical column. Animals stop calling for lots of reasons. Weather pressure change, a predator in the immediate vicinity causing a localized suppression. But what I experienced twice in those 4 months on that slope was something with a different character than weather suppression or a nearby predator. The silence came from a direction and moved in a way that felt, and I use that word deliberately, intentional. It started on the uphill slope and came down through the canopy layer and then the understory, and everything that was vocalizing stopped within about a 30-second window. And then it stayed quiet for about 10 minutes, and then the sounds resumed from the downhill edge outward. Both times this happened, I was within 200 yards of where I'd previously found sign. Both times, when I looked carefully after the fact, I found a fresh impression or a disturbed branch that I hadn't seen before. The silence. In December, about 4 months after Wren's encounter, I had a direct sighting. I want to describe this precisely, and I want to be clear about what I did and did not see. I was doing a winter low-flow survey on the upper tributary, the section that runs through the old-growth corridor along the east-facing slope. Gray morning, the light that never fully comes up on the Olympic Peninsula in December, the kind of overcast that makes the whole world feel like the inside of a cloud. The moss was dripping. The creek was running clear and cold and low, the way it does in December between rain events. I was alone, working a kick net and sorting invertebrate drift at a riffle station. I heard a varied thrush call from the east bank. One call, the two-note tone, and then silence. I looked up. On the east bank, about 50 yards upstream, something was standing at the creek margin at the edge of the old-growth canopy. Upright, dark, not black, the same reddish-brown I'd been looking for and documenting, but in the gray December light it registered as dark. Tall. 7 feet was my estimate in the moment, though I know how imprecise height estimates are at 50 yards with a poorly defined skyline background. Wide at the shoulders. The head was slightly forward of vertical, a slight lean to the posture that was not the posture of a person standing up straight. The arms hung lower than a person's arms would. The face was turned toward me. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out features, but I could see that it was watching me. Not moving, just standing at the creek margin, watching me sort invertebrates in the white tray. I looked at it for 4, maybe 5 seconds. It looked at me. Then it stepped back into the tree line without a sound. Not a splash, not a branch snap, not a footfall on the cobble bank. Just gone. I stood by the creek for a long time after. The varied thrush started again. A winter wren began its song from the undergrowth on my side. The creek ran. The world came back. I packed my equipment and walked to my truck at the Forest Service road. I sat in the truck for a while, and then I opened my field journal. I wrote, adult-sized bipedal subject observed 0914, East Bank approximately 50 minutes upstream of Station 4. Duration approximately 5 seconds. Subject departed into old growth. No audible sign. Varied thrush resumed approximately 90 seconds after subject departure. Then I drove home. That is the closest I have come to a direct sighting in 16 years of working in this drainage. 5 seconds at 50 yards. I did not have my camera out. The light was wrong for a useful photograph, anyway. What I have is what I saw and what I wrote down. I've spoken to Ernie Sampson a second time since all of this began. After I found the carcass and before the December sighting, I told him about the carcass on the gravel bar and what I'd found at the gorge afterward and the track measurements and the corridor I'd been mapping. He listened without interrupting, which is how Ernie listens to things. When I was done, he said, "You're sure the one your daughter saw was small?" I said yes, 4 feet, she estimated. The tracks measured 9 3/4 inches. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The small one is still there." It wasn't a question. I said yes. He said, "Then it's all right. They take care of their own. It's not alone now." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Doesn't have to be the mother. They're people. They have others. When something happens to one of them, the others take care of what's left." He paused. "It might take time, but something went looking for it after your daughter saw it. Something noticed it wasn't where it should be." That conversation has stayed with me more than any other since this started. I want to come back to Wren, because the story is hers more than it's mine. She's doing all right. The whole light stays on. She hasn't gone past the creek alone since August, but she's been talking about what she saw more comfortably since September, and the way she talks about it has evolved in the way a kid's thinking evolves when they've been chewing on something seriously for a few months. About 6 weeks after the encounter, she said to me at breakfast, out of nowhere, "I think it was trying to figure out what I was." I asked what she meant. She said, "Like how you study the fish. You count them and you watch what they do. But you don't bother them. That's what it was doing." I said, "You think it was curious about you?" She said, "Yeah, and I think it was alone." She ate some cereal. And when you're alone, you're curious about other things that are also alone, because there's nothing else to do. She'd been alone on that hillside. That's true. I said, "Were you scared?" She thought about this for a while. Then, not really scared, more like, I felt bad for it. Like when Tugboat does that thing when he doesn't know where you went and he sits by the door. Tugboat, who pressed himself to her leg instead of barking, who defaulted to proximity over alarm when he encountered something he had no behavioral program for. In February, I left food at the stick structure near the seep clearing for the 3rd time. The first 2 times I'd left apples. This time I left dried salmon that I'd cured myself. A handful of strips in a Ziploc bag, which I opened and laid out on the top of the structure so the smell would be accessible. The salmon was gone the next morning. The apples had been taken too, previously. This proves nothing. There are bears and raccoons and crows working every food source in that drainage. But the apples and the salmon have been gone within 24 hours every time. And the stick structures are not the kind of feature that bears typically visit. And the apples I left were placed inside the structure in a way that would require dexterity to remove without knocking the whole thing apart. Both times the structure was intact when I returned. Both times the apples were gone. I'm documenting this not because I think it proves something, but because I think it's the right kind of information to have if you're trying to understand something. What I keep coming back to, the question that sits at the center of all of this, it is what was happening on that hillside in the days before and after August 9th. The juvenile was there. It saw Wren. It followed her. It showed itself to her at the tree line before she crossed the creek. That final appearance, clear and deliberate, standing in the open for several seconds before stepping back into the old growth. Why show itself? It had maintained careful concealment for the entire walk down from the seep clearing. Why break that concealment at the last moment, at the water's edge before she was gone? The most straightforward answer is that it wanted to be seen. That the following and the watching weren't just curiosity, but something with a social component. Something that wanted contact at some level, even if the contact it chose was minimal and at distance. Standing at the tree line and letting her see you before you go is a kind of farewell, or an acknowledgement, or both. I have read enough of the serious literature and talked to enough people whose opinions I respect to know that the social complexity implied by that behavior is not unusual in the documented accounts. Accounts from tribal sources and from field researchers consistently describe beings that are aware of human observers and that make deliberate choices about how visible to be and when, not consistently hiding, not consistently presenting, modulating based on context, a juvenile, alone, a human child in its territory, a child who wasn't threatening, who had a dog that also wasn't threatening, who was alone, who walked at a pace the juvenile could match without effort. That's a specific set of conditions. Under those conditions, something curious and probably young enough not to have fully internalized whatever rules the adults operate by made a series of choices. Follow her, keep distance, show yourself at the last moment, then go back. And on the far side of this story, the side I can only infer, something that was adult and present in that drainage did not make it out of a flood event. And the juvenile it left behind found itself alone in a corridor it knew. and it noticed a human child in that corridor on an August afternoon, and it followed her to the edge of its territory and watched her cross to the other side. And then, by what Ernie said, and by what I believe, something eventually came looking for it. It's March now. Wren has been asking to go across the creek again with me, not alone, with me. She wants to go back to the seep clearing, and she's stated this as a fact rather than a request. I want to go back and look. I said, when it's a little drier, when the creek drops more. She said, it's fine, I know where to step. She's right, she knows where to step. She's known where to step in that drainage since she was 4 years old. I've told her we'll go in April, when the light is better and I can see what I'm looking at and there's time in the afternoon before the dark comes. She said, okay. And then she said, do you think it'll be there? I thought about that for a long time. I said, I think something will be there. She nodded at this like it was the answer she expected. The hall light is still on. She still doesn't go past the creek alone. But in the evenings, after dinner, when the light is still in the sky for another half hour or so, she takes tugboat to the creek bank and stands there looking at the old-growth hillside. She's not looking for anything specific. She's just looking the way you look at a landscape you have a relationship with. The way I look at that drainage after 16 years of working in it. Tugboat stands beside her. He doesn't press against her leg anymore, not the way he did on the trail. He stands beside her loosely, ears relaxed, and he looks across the water at the timber. I watch them from the window sometimes. An 11-year-old in rubber boots looking at old-growth forest in the early evening light, with a big red dog beside her. I don't know what's on the far side of that creek looking back. I think something is. I think something in those trees has been watching this property for longer than we've been on it, and I think it knows the difference, as Ernie's grandfather said, between someone just passing through and someone who's staying. We're staying, and whatever is in that old growth, whatever followed my daughter home and let her see it at the tree line and then stepped back into the dark, I think it knows that. I think it's known that for a while. And I think what happened on that hillside last August was its own kind of introduction, tentative, careful, at a maintained distance, made by something young that didn't fully know the rules yet. Whatever those rules are, I'm learning them too. We all are. I want to go back to the question of the smells, because I've been trying to understand them more precisely. And I think it's worth taking the time to describe what a specific smell can tell you in field biology. Smell is the most underused data point in wildlife field work. We spend a lot of time on tracks, on scat, on hair, on camera traps. We don't spend as much time thinking about odor signatures, because odor is transient and subjective and hard to document in any rigorous way. But smell is what animals use most to understand their environment, and the odors that animals leave are not accidental. They're communication. A bear's scat at a trail junction is a marker. An elk's rubs along a run say something about who's been there and how recently. The specific chemistry of what an animal eats, where it sleeps, how its body processes everything it consumes, all of that ends up in its odor signature. What I've smelled in the Cotter Creek corridor doesn't fit any animal I've worked around for 16 years. I want to be careful about that claim because it's easy to say and hard to prove. But let me break down what I can actually say. Black bear. I know what black bear smells like, from proximity to active bears, from their scat, from the musky grassy odor of a bear bed found fresh, from the heavy complex smell of a bear rolling in something as they do. Black bear odor is animal and grassy and has a sweet undertone in the summer when they're eating berries. In fall, when they're eating salmon carcasses, it changes and goes to something more fishy and richer. The odor I've encountered in the corridor doesn't match the grassy quality of black bear, and it doesn't have the sweet berry component or the fish and fat component. It's heavier and more complex. Elk. Elk have a distinctive smell that's mostly hay-like and grassy, with a musk underneath that intensifies dramatically during the rut. A bull elk in the rut smells like an animal that hasn't bathed in months while working in a strong odor environment, which is exactly what he is. The smell I've encountered in the corridor doesn't have the haygrass quality of elk, not even at low intensity. Cougar. Cougar spray is unmistakable. A cat urine component that's sharp and penetrating and stays in your nostrils for a long time. The general body odor of a cougar that I've encountered near fresh kills is more complex, but still has that cat musk quality. The corridor smell doesn't have a cat component. What it does have, and this is my best description after multiple encounters, is a base musk that's animal and warm, heavy, with a sour component underneath that reminds me most of a large herbivore's digestive process, the smell of a fermentation system processing a lot of plant material. But there's something underneath even that which I don't have an equivalent for. Something that sits in the back of the throat and has a quality that I've described to myself as almost like ozone, the electrical smell before a lightning strike, but organic rather than mineral. I don't know what produces that component. I've read some of the research literature that discusses the infrasound hypothesis, the idea that some large primates produce very low-frequency sound that causes a physiological response in nearby humans, including a sensation of unease, altered smell perception, and the specific feeling of being watched. And I've wondered whether what I'm perceiving has a non-chemical component, a frequency component that my sensory system is processing as a smell even when it isn't one. I don't know. I'm a fisheries technician, not an olfactory researcher or a neuroscientist. What I can say is that I've encountered an odor in the Cotter Creek corridor that I cannot identify as any known animal 3 times in the months following Wren's encounter, and that each time I've encountered it, I've subsequently found physical sign within 200 yards of the location. I've been reading the serious research on the Olympic Peninsula history of these accounts, and I want to share a few things that I think are relevant to what happened to Wren and what I've been documenting since. The Quinault Indian Nation has an oral tradition that extends back through recorded history and well before it. The specific accounts that have been shared publicly, and I want to be respectful here about what's been shared publicly versus what's kept within the community, describe beings in the forest that are understood to be a form of people, not animals, not supernatural beings in the Western sense. People with a different relationship to the forest than human people, with their own territories, their own social structures, their own rules about contact with human communities. The Quinault relationship with these beings, as described by the accounts that have been made public, was historically one of mutual awareness and deliberate non-interference. The people knew the forest people were there. The forest people knew the human settlements were there. There was a boundary, not a formal treaty, not a negotiated thing, but a functional understanding of territory and behavior. The human communities didn't go deep into certain sections of the old growth after dark. The forest people didn't enter the settlements. This boundary held because both sides maintained it. What happened in the 20th century? Logging, road building, the fragmentation of old-growth habitat, pushed on this arrangement in ways that the oral tradition suggests created new problems. Not conflict in the attack and defense sense, but something more like displacement, the way development displaces any wildlife population. The forest people retreated into the remaining old growth, the protected areas, the roadless wilderness sections. Their interactions with humans became rarer and more fraught. Ernie hasn't told me all of this directly. Some of it comes from public statements by tribal cultural representatives that I've found in archived materials. Some of it comes from Ernie in the margins of conversations about other things. He's never sat me down and given me a lecture on Quinault tradition. It's come in pieces, over years, and I've tried to hold those pieces carefully. What I take from it, in the context of what happened to Wren, the corridor east of Cotter Creek is part of the protected old growth that the Quinault oral tradition has always understood as the territory of the forest people. Our property, and our presence in it for the past 12 years, has been within the awareness of whatever is in that territory. Ernie's comment, that they know the difference between someone passing through and someone staying, applies to us. We are the neighbors. We have been the neighbors for 12 years. The juvenile that followed Wren was young enough not to have the full behavioral protocol for dealing with the neighbors. The adults know to stay back, stay hidden, maintain the arrangement. The juvenile didn't know that yet, or knew it, and was too curious and too alone to follow it properly. What it did, following a child through familiar territory, maintaining distance but staying close, showing itself at the last moment before the boundary, is not aggression and it's not random. It's a kind of contact, a kind of reaching across the distance between two kinds of people who share a watershed. I find myself hoping that what came after, the group finding the juvenile eventually, the integration back into a family. I find myself hoping that what came after didn't remove it completely from that reaching. That somewhere in the old growth east of Cotter Creek, there's something that was curious enough to follow a human child to the creek edge and show itself at the tree line. And that it's still curious, and that whatever it learned from those 40 minutes on the trail in August is still somewhere in its experience. That's a sentimental hope, and I know it. But I'm not going to apologize for it. The stick structures deserve more attention than I've given them, because they're one of the more unusual and consistent elements of what I've been documenting. The first one was at the seep clearing, found the night after Wren's encounter, 3 sticks across a forked branch stub at chest height. Simple. The second was at the gorge near where I found the carcass. More sticks, more carefully arranged, larger sticks at shoulder height. The third was at the upper tributary in the fall, after the salmon were in. Largest of the 3, most complex, involving a forked branch and several lateral sticks, creating something that had more structural complexity than a simple lay-across. Stick structures, or what researchers sometimes call debris structures or instinctual construction, appear in the Bigfoot encounter literature going back decades. They're one of the less analyzed pieces of evidence because they're ambiguous. Sticks fall, weather events push things together, animals knock debris into configurations that can look purposeful. All of that is true. But the specific structures I've found share characteristics that are harder to attribute to natural processes. Multiple sticks at similar angles, weight-bearing arrangements, height placement that requires reaching or deliberate placement from above. The seep clearing structure was inside a forked stub about 5 feet off the ground. To place those sticks in that configuration, someone or something had to hold the sticks at that height while placing them, which either requires being tall or requires deliberate construction from a height. I've been watching what happens to these structures over time. The one at the seep clearing I've checked on 11 times since August. It's been modified. Not destroyed, not randomly altered. Modified. On my 3rd check visit in late September, 2 of the original 3 sticks had been replaced with longer sticks. The angles were similar to the original but adjusted. On my 6th check visit, a smaller lateral stick had been added at a perpendicular angle to the main arrangement. It looks more built than it did when I first found it. I don't know what these structures mean. I've read speculation that they're markers, territorial indicators, communication structures, or simply products of nest building or manipulation behavior without specific communicative intent. I don't know which of those is right. What I know is that the structure at the seep clearing has been maintained and modified over 7 months, which suggests that whatever made it has returned to the location consistently and has continued to interact with the structure. The location of the structure directly adjacent to the track site and in the clearing where Wren found the hare is not incidental. The seep clearing is a specific, defined spot in the old-growth corridor. The juvenile was there before Wren was. The structure was there. I didn't see it on my first nighttime visit, but that was in poor light, and I was focused on the tracks. On my daylight return, I found it. Whatever the seep clearing is to the juvenile, it's a place it returns to. A food site, a shelter site, a marker for something. I don't know. But it returns there. And I've been leaving food there for 4 months. And the food goes. Last thing. My daughter has a drawing she made in October that she taped to the wall above her desk. She drew it herself, with pencil, and then colored in some parts with marker. It shows the seep clearing from the angle she would have seen it from, the vine maple in the foreground, the hemlock trunks behind, the light coming through the canopy gaps above. In the shadow of one of the hemlocks there's a shape. She drew it carefully, the long arms, the relative proportion of the shoulders to the height, the forward lean of the posture. She put in the eyes. 2 small amber marks in the shadow, the only color in an otherwise black and white drawing. Under the drawing she wrote in her careful printed handwriting, "I saw you. You saw me." That's okay. I've looked at that drawing a lot in the past few months. Wren put into 12 words what I've been trying to organize into 47 pages of field notes. I saw you. You saw me. That's okay. That's the whole thing, really. A mutual acknowledgement in a forest that's been growing for nearly a century without being disturbed. Something young and curious and alone, and a child who was also alone and also curious, and 40 minutes on a game trail in August with the old trees around them and the creek below, and then the tree line and the stepping stones, and each of them going back to where they came from. That's okay. That's exactly the right response to what happened. Wren figured it out before I did. We're going back to the seep clearing this weekend. Whatever's there is welcome to watch us. We'll do the same. And then we'll leave it alone, the way you leave alone something that is living well in the place it's always lived. And you go back down to the creek, and cross on the stepping stones, and go home. That's the arrangement. It's been the arrangement in this valley for a long time. We're staying. We're paying attention. We're not going to hurt anything. I think they know that. I think we're okay. I've been thinking about what it means to document something that officially doesn't exist. This is a real problem, not just philosophically, but practically. My field notes from the Cotter Creek corridor for the past 7 months describe sign that, if I were to submit them through normal channels as part of my state wildlife work, would require me to identify the source species. There's a box for that on the form. I can't put unclassified large primate in that box. I can't put Sasquatch. I can't put unknown bipedal subject. The form doesn't have those options because the existence of what I'd be describing is not formally acknowledged by the agency I work for or the scientific framework those forms operate within. So those notes don't go on those forms. They go in a separate journal, my personal notes, which exist outside the official record of my work in this drainage. That creates a split in the documentation of this watershed. The official record, which is complete and accurate as far as it goes, and the personal record, which contains significant additional information about what's actually happening in the corridor. I'm not comfortable with that split. I've never been comfortable with it. But the alternative, making an official report of sign that would immediately be treated as evidence of a mental health problem or a serious professional lapse, is not an option I can choose while I'm still working in this district, doing work that I believe matters, producing data that goes into salmon recovery assessments that affect real policy. So I document it privately, and I share it selectively, and I wait. Gary Wesson told me once in a context that had nothing to do with my specific situation, but that I've applied to it anyway. The institutional machinery for acknowledging new species is not designed for something with this level of existing human awareness. For a new fish species or a new invertebrate, the discovery pathway is straightforward. For something that thousands of people have encountered and reported, and that has been systematically dismissed for decades, the pathway is much more complicated, because the first thing you have to do before you can establish scientific credibility is account for why all those prior reports were dismissed and what has changed. And that accounting has to be done by someone with enough institutional standing that their account doesn't also get dismissed. It's a status problem as much as an evidence problem. He said this might take a long time to resolve, by which he meant it might take longer than either of us is professionally active. He said the best contribution either of us can make in the meantime is clean documentation, rigorously sourced from a defined geographic corridor, produced by someone with identifiable professional credentials and a 16-year track record in that specific watershed. That's what I have. That's what I'm building. And when the time is right, when someone with the right standing is in the right position to make the accounting Gary described, this documentation will be part of what's available for that work. I believe that time is coming. I don't know exactly when, but the number of credentialed field biologists and wildlife researchers who have quietly accumulated the kind of evidence I've been accumulating is not small. I've now been in correspondence with 3 of them since reaching out to Dr. Halvorsen. 3 researchers, working in 3 different parts of the Pacific Northwest, all of whom are maintaining personal documentation outside their official records, all of whom are waiting for the same thing. That's not a fringe phenomenon. That's a structural problem in how science handles something that doesn't fit the currently acknowledged taxonomy. Something will break it open eventually. It always does. The other thing I keep coming back to is the question of what we owe the thing in the forest. I've been in wildlife conservation work for 20 years, if you include the hatchery time. The entire framework of that work is built on the premise that certain species, certain ecosystems, certain populations have a claim on our attention and our protection. Not because they're useful to us, but because they exist. And the existence of complex biological systems has an inherent value that we're responsible for acknowledging. That framework is applied to salmon, to elk, to cougars, to murrelets and marbled murrelets, and every other species that requires old-growth habitat for its survival. The framework is well developed and well institutionalized and generates the specific work I do every day, the surveys and the counts, and the habitat assessments, and the recovery plans. If what's living in the old growth east of Cotter Creek is what I think it is, a population, however small, of beings that are behaviorally and cognitively at least as sophisticated as the great apes we extend enormous conservation resources toward protecting, then the framework I work within doesn't stop applying just because the entity in question isn't taxonomically described. The existence and the sophistication and the continued presence in that corridor are facts. The framework is about facts. I find myself thinking about this because my daughter is going to grow up in a world where the question of what we owe these beings is going to have to be answered somehow. Whether the formal acknowledgement happens in my lifetime or hers or her children's, it's going to happen. And when it does, the record of how we treated them before the acknowledgement is going to matter. The documentation of encounters, the choices made about reporting, the decisions made about habitat, all of that will be part of the history of the relationship between humans and whatever this is. I want the record to show that in this specific drainage, in this specific corridor, the person doing the documentation treated the thing in the forest with the same care and the same respect he'd bring to any other wildlife population he was responsible for. No more than that. That's the bar. That's what I'm trying to clear. Tara asked me last week if I was scared, not of the thing in the forest specifically, but of what it means. The uncertainty of it. The fact that I've seen what I've seen and found what I've found, and I don't fully know what I'm in the middle of. I thought about it for a while. I said, the thing in the forest doesn't scare me anymore. Maybe it should. Maybe I've been in proximity to it enough times now that the fear response has habituated in a way it shouldn't. But what I feel when I'm in that corridor, and the birds go quiet, and the smell comes down the slope, is not fear. It's more like what I feel when I'm sampling a section of the river that's running exceptionally well. The right temperature, the right flow, the right invertebrate density, the salmon density higher than the model predicted. The feeling that something is working. Something is right here in the way that it's supposed to be right. The feeling of a system functioning the way it was designed to function before we started taking pieces out of it. There is something living in that old growth that has been there for a long time. It's not a threat to us. It's not a mystery we need to solve, or a resource we need to extract, or a problem we need to manage. It's a thing in the world that exists, and that existence is part of what the world is. I'm not scared of that. I'm grateful for it, in the particular way you're grateful for something when you thought you'd lost it, and then you realized it was always still there. Wren figured this out before me. She figured it out standing at the creek bank in rubber boots with a dog beside her, looking at the dark timber. She said, "I saw you. You saw me." That's okay. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's everything. I want to tell you about one more moment. This one, from February, a few days after the January road encounter. I was driving back from a late survey, coming down the Forest Service road toward home, about 7 in the evening, the full dark of a February evening in the valley. The headlights on the truck catch maybe 60 feet ahead on that road. Past 60 feet, it's just the dark and the tree line. I was coming around the last bend before the straight that leads to our gate when the headlights caught something at the edge of the road, in the ditch vegetation, about 30 feet ahead. Something close to the ground, moving fast, paralleling the road in the ditch brush. My first thought was, deer, moving fast in the ditch. But it was close to the ground in a way that deer don't move when they're paralleling a road. Deer go upright when they're running, their backs visible above the brush. This was moving low, weaving through the brush stems, and it was moving fast. I slowed down. The thing in the ditch brush cleared the ditch and was across the road and into the timber on the far side in about 2 seconds. I'd stopped the truck by then. The headlights showed an empty road. I sat there for a moment. Then I got out. The road was quiet. The February air was cold and damp, that bone-deep wet cold that the Peninsula does in winter. I walked to where the thing had crossed the road and looked at the road surface in my headlights. No clear tracks on the gravel. The road had been graded recently, and the surface was too hard for impressions. But in the ditch, in the wet grass on the downslope side, there was matted vegetation where something had passed through at speed. The matting was recent, the grass still recovering from the compression, small area, the size of something maybe 4 feet long, moving low through the ditch. I went back to the truck, a juvenile moving fast at ground level, through roadside brush in the dark. Not running upright the way it appeared in the August encounter, moving low, efficient, using the cover. An 8-month animal is not the same as a 5-month animal. An 8-month animal that's been in a family group for some number of those months, learning. practicing. That animal has different skills than the one that followed my daughter down the trail in August. That animal is growing into what it's going to be. I drove home and I told Tara I'd seen it again. She made us both tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She said, "It's learning." Yes, it's learning. They all learn. That's what growing up is. There is a particular sound I associate with the Cotter Creek corridor in the early morning of a spring day, and I want to end with this because it's what the whole story comes back to for me. The sound that is the creek over cobble in the flat section below the stepping stones. The shallow riffled section where the creek runs at its most exposed, between the willows and the red alder that close in on both sides just upstream. In spring, that riffled section gets the first light of morning, which in the Quinault Valley means not bright sunlight, but the first lifted gray of the overcast, the light brightening from inside the clouds, rather than coming from a clear sky. The creek in that light sounds different than it does at midday or evening, clearer, more individual, each stone and each bubble audible in a way that midday wind or the louder ambient noise of a fully awake landscape covers. That sound is what you hear if you're at the creek in early morning before anything else is moving, before the birds start, before the wind picks up, before the day makes its full weight felt. That sound is the water and the stones and nothing else, and it's the most continuous thing in this drainage, the thread that goes back further than anything else in this specific piece of land. The salmon hear that sound from the ocean. They follow it from hundreds of miles away. The elk and the deer and the bears and whatever else lives in the timber around that creek hear it every day. I hear it every time I survey that drainage, which is several times a week for most of the year. And something else hears it, has been hearing it for a long time. Whatever that is, it lives here the way the creek lives here. Not because it was put here, not because it's managed or monitored or acknowledged by any framework outside itself, but because it belongs to this place, and this place belongs to it. And that relationship goes back past any record that exists. My daughter stood at the creek bank and looked across at the old growth on the far side, and she said, "I saw you. You saw me." That's okay. That's all it was. That's what it will always be, at the core of it. Two kinds of people in the same watershed, in the same rain, beside the same creek. That seems like enough.